The Federal Reserve is one of the biggest scams in the world, and it was actually formed through a secret plot that some of the most powerful people in the world were involved with. This was a plot that was dreamed up over 100 years ago, and it's still with us today.
Now, as to the Federal Reserve, and most people don't even know what this is and how it works. The Federal Reserve Bank, the name is on the dollar bill. So it's a government organization, right? It's a government institution. No, it's not. It's a private company run by the banks that has the right to create money out of nothing and then sell that to the US government in exchange for debt. And if that doesn't sound crazy to you, I mean, what does? That is insanity. And that organization has the ability to create an infinite amount of money, set the interest rates between bank lending, and is completely independent of government control. And that was considered a good thing because government manipulated money. Now money manipulates government.
I'm not a financial advisor. Welcome to the channel. I'm your host, The BitBoy. And today we are getting deep. If you want your political, financial, and historical IQs to increase, then watch this entire video. Federal Reserve is one of the most powerful institutions in the world, and it seems like it's been a part of our government from the very beginning. But it's only been around a little over a century, and it's not technically a part of the government. In this video, we're going to talk about the formation and development of the Federal Reserve, using research from one of the best books on the subject, The Creature from Jekyll Island by G. Edward Griffin. The title of this book is actually taken from a place called Jekyll Island, which was the location for a secret meeting of bankers that took place in 1910. And the creature in the book's title is a symbol of the Federal Reserve itself. Before the Federal Reserve was established, bankers in Europe, especially in London, desperately wanted to install a central bank in the United States because our economy was such an important part of the global market. They wanted our system to be compatible with theirs, but they also wanted to control it. This was the goal for generations of bankers, but the American people were very resistant to the idea of a central bank because these were the days when our culture was still a bit independent and rebellious. The American people were not going to give up without a major crisis, so that's what they got. In early America, banking crashes were not usual, but they usually weren't systemic problems because the system was much more decentralized than it is today. But in the 1900s, the banks started to get bigger, stock markets became more relevant, and both became more integrated with everyday life. There were also some important alliances being formed between powerful bankers in the US and Europe at the time, especially between J.P. Morgan and Paul Warburg. J.P. Morgan helped bring many of the European bankers into the country, and it all started with a banking crisis in 1907. The bank panic of 1907 began when the Knickerbocker Trust Company in New York City collapsed, leading to a massive panic and runs on banks across the country. According to the official story, Knickerbocker went down because it was being mismanaged, but there was apparently much more to the story. Griffin says that the collapse was actually orchestrated by J.P. Morgan and his friends, who spread rumors about the Knickerbocker Trust Company to manufacture a run on the bank. Then, when the panic began, Morgan refused to help, but still bailed out many other banks and trust companies that were struggling from the contagion. In the aftermath of the panic, there was a major push from the bankers and politicians to install a central bank in the United States, and there was a massive media campaign to support it. A group called the National Monetary Commission was established in 1908 to study the banking system and recommend changes. And guess what they recommended? You guessed it, a central bank. Before we get into how the Federal Reserve was established, we need to talk about why it was such an important goal for the big bankers. Central banks are basically banking cartels, which allow a small handful of people to control entire countries. By establishing a central bank, the bankers could control the issuance of currency and the creation of credit, giving them serious power over the economy. This control allowed them to manipulate the monetary supply to their advantage. Creating inflation or deflation is needed to protect their financial interests. A central bank also allowed the major banking interests to create a more stable and predictable financial environment by regulating the amount of money in circulation and managing interest rates. This helped protect established banks from competition with smaller independent banks, which were starting to become a threat to their businesses. Centralizing control over the money supply allowed banks to coordinate their actions more effectively. They became more efficient. Instead of competing with each other for control of credit and interest rates, the establishment of the Federal Reserve allowed banks to operate under a unified monetary policy. By managing the economy through a central institution, banks could better control inflation, deflation, and the overall direction of economic growth. But the most important thing was the power it gave them over the government. The Federal Reserve is supposed to be independent, but we all know that it is heavily influenced by the banking sector. This control allows bankers to shape government policies in ways that benefit their own interests by controlling inflation or influencing the availability of credit to punish or reward politicians to force them to follow orders. Establishing a central bank also helped insulate the banking sector from public scrutiny and political backlash. Federal Reserve's complex structure made it difficult for the average American to understand how it operated, allowing the bankers to work behind the scenes without anyone questioning their actions. Central banks like the Federal Reserve operate as cartels designed to protect the interests of the banking elite.
Well, you asked the question in your book, The Creature from Jekyll Island, what is the Federal Reserve, and what is your answer?
Well, what it is, it's a cartel. It's not a government agency. It has the appearance of it being a government agency, and they went to great lengths to give it that facade. It does have the power of government because Congress voted to give the power of enforcement to it. But in its essence, underneath it, it's a cartel. It's nothing different than a banana cartel or an oil cartel or sugar cartel. It happens to be a banking cartel. They got together, they drew up the rules and regulations for their own industry, to self-regulate their own industry is what cartels do, and then they sent it to Congress, and they took off the label at the top that said banking cartel, and they erased that, and they said Federal Reserve Act. Congress passed it into law, and that's why we think it's a government agency, is because if you don't obey the rules that they set down for their own industry, you go to prison. And so it looks like a government agency. But basically the answer to your question is, it's a banking cartel.
While Nelson Aldrich was making his push for a central bank in DC, he was meeting secretly with the world's biggest bankers to sort out the plan. The most important and infamous meeting was the one that took place at Jekyll Island in 1910. Aldrich invited the Assistant Treasury Secretary, Abram Piatt Andrew, along with some big-time banking executives like Frank A. Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York, Henry P. Davison, a senior partner at J.P. Morgan, Charles D. Norton, president of the First National Bank of New York, Benjamin Strong, who was also representing J.P. Morgan. Strong would become the first head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. The most important attendee was probably Paul M. Warburg, a close associate of the Both Children family and one of the main architects of the Federal Reserve. The group took a private train car from New Jersey down to Jekyll Island, and they were under strict orders to maintain their secrecy. They were not allowed to tell anyone about the details of the trip, and they were told only to use their first names when they were on the train, so the servants wouldn't be able to repeat the first and last names to the press. Some of the bankers even changed their first names for the trip too. The train also left at night so they could easily meet without being seen. They even had a cover story. If anyone asked where they were going, they were instructed to say that they were going duck hunting with some friends. They even traveled with hunting gear like guns and fishing rods to strengthen the alibi. Most of the attendees would stay silent about the meeting for the rest of their lives, but a few of them spoke out long after the Federal Reserve was established. Frank Vanderlip, president of the National City Bank of New York and a representative of the other Feller family, discussed the secrecy of the event in an article he wrote for the Saturday Evening Post in 1935. Vanderlip wrote, "There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secretive, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator. I do not feel it is any exaggeration to speak of our secret expedition to Jekyll Island as the occasion of the actual conception of what eventually became the Federal Reserve System." In the same article, Vanderlip explained why secrecy was so important. "We were told to leave our last names behind us. We were told further that we should avoid dining together on the night of our departure. We were instructed to come one at a time and as unobtrusively as possible to the terminal station of the New Jersey Littoral of the Hudson, where Senator Aldrich's private car would be in readiness, attached to the rear end of the train for the South." During the meeting, the group came up with a framework that Senator Nelson Aldrich would take back to DC and recommend as new legislation. They called it the Aldrich Plan, and it basically advocated for a central bank, which would be able to control the economy enough to prevent major economic crashes. When Aldrich first tried to pass the plan through Congress, it didn't gather the votes that he needed, and the proposal was defeated. But that was just the beginning. The bankers continued to push for a central bank, and they invested more money into lobbying politicians. For the election of 1912, Wall Street pumped a ton of money into funding both sides of the race between Democrat Woodrow Wilson and Republican William Howard Taft. So no matter who won, the bankers would have a man in the White House. Woodrow Wilson ended up being the winner, and as soon as he got into office, he promised he would make compromises that would make the critics happy, like promising that the central bank would have more transparency and more public oversight. But we all saw how that worked out. In 1913, within a year of Wilson getting into office, he signed the Federal Reserve Act into law. The act established the Federal Reserve System with a board of governors appointed by the president and regional Federal Reserve banks that were privately owned by member banks. This structure was pitched as a way to balance public oversight with private banking interests. But this was all just for show. It was really the bankers who were in control. That's all I got. Be blessed. Bit Boy out.